Today we'll revise whatever we have learned. Started with Webpack. So you need to know Webpack, so you can go through that my playlist. So as a React developer, whenever you are in interview also, you need to explain or create a Webpack configuration, basic configuration, not production ready. So entry, output, and module. So just simple style and Babel loader. So these things you need to create. Dev server is also required. So you need to write this code yourself and start your Webpack server. So you need to demonstrate so how you can create a Webpack application. So you don't need create React app or Vue.js. So because in industry projects, Webpack is used because you can have different configuration for environment and production environment. Local environment, development environment, production environment, then UAT environment. All these environment will have separate configuration that you define in .env file. So this is a development environment, so you don't have any configuration here. But if you go to that playlist, so this Webpack playlist, I have explained all the environment, production environment configuration also. Now this was now we after that we started with contact manager class components. Let's go to the so here we started with class component, how lifecycle method works, how event handlers work. So you need to remember always use this inside class component. That's how you need to access all the for event handlers that you have, and you need to define state in the parent. So if you see, we have multiple component here. Add contact, contact list. So when we add contact from this add contact form component, so here is contact form. So when you add, you need to store that data somewhere and you need to pass it to list component. So that's why it's common to create a component state in the parent component. So you can share that directly with any of the component. So this is known as lifting state up. So this is a common question also, what is lifting state up? So when you want to share some data with all of the components, we define the state in the parent component. So all other component can directly access that. So you don't need to create a function inside parent and then pass to add contact, then pass to any other contact component. So this is how you use state, and state is always an object in class component. If you are using functional component, it can be object, string, boolean, or anything. And here while updating, you need to remember, you just specify what property you need to update. So you can have multiple properties in a state, but while updating any of the property, you just specify that property. So all other properties will be merged, automatically merged. You don't have to worry about manually specifying them. So this is all about class component. If you are using functional component, you need to manually merge them if you are storing object in the state. So that's one of the difference. And the component did update method, component did mount method. So this gets executed when the component is mounted only once, and after every time when the component is remounted. And component did update, this is where if you want to update some state or reassign some state value when something changes, this component did update you can use. So this method gets called whenever props changes or state changes. So either of them, whenever changes, this method gets called. So you always need one condition which will execute that code only when that condition is met. So if you are doing some set state here, that will not work. So if you directly set, let's say contacts, an array or something 1 2 3, so this will not work. You will get infinite loop issue because this component did update always gets called whenever state or prop changes. So you always need one condition inside which you need to update the state, because whenever you set state, component will get updated. So component will get re-render, and whenever component get re-render, the state will change. So this component did update method will again get called. So it will go into infinite loop. So that's why you need a condition, so using which you can stop that infinite loop. So only when previous contacts and current contacts are not set same, then only you execute this code. So it will not go into infinite loop even if the component re-render multiple times. because this condition will not be true on every re-render. So that's what you need to remember. And we don't have component VLAN mount, so that is also method. I think we have explored that in Webpack. Did mount, did update and unmount. So this is useful to do all the cleanup. So if you have in your component you are adding some event listener or you are setting some interval, you always need to clear that. Don't forget to clear. So if you are using set interval, make sure to store that interval and clear that interval. So we are storing this in a state. So where you can see here, we have declared that state because this variable is local inside this particular function. So if I want to access that inside any other function, I need to store that in state. So state is where we store all the component data, because if you re-render the component, the state data will be reinitialized. So if I say name equal to Mike, so every re-render like this, name equal to Mike. So on every re-render of app component, this name will be reinitialized. So to avoid that, we use state. So state is, even though you declare state in component, it's not actually stored in component. So it does not get reset even if the component re-render. It maintains the previous state. So whenever you update, you will always have that last updated state. So you need to make sure you set state interval, and then in the component VLAN mount, you need to clear that interval. So even though it does not display on the UI, like you are missing that clearing, but you need to always remember, if you are creating interval or adding event listener, remove that inside component unmount. Otherwise that code will always get executed even if your application is unmounted. So this will, so what will happen if you are not clearing? So the code is still there in the memory, and it is known as memory leak. So even if your application is not running, you have closed the browser, still there is that code is there in the memory. So computer memory, like RAM. So it's still there. So you will be facing out of memory issue if your lot of applications are opened and you will not have some space to store that data, extra information. So that's a rare case, but you should always clear that interval or remove event listener. And set state, you have two ways of setting state: directly pass function object, or you can also pass function. So here this is the functional way. So you can either use one of them, but make sure, so if you have multiple set state calls one after another, or if you have some function like this process data, so inside that you have again set state. So in that case, it's better to use functional way, because in functional you always get that previous state and you will have final state which gets updated. So with this object state, so if you do like this, so even though I incremented count 3 times, the count will be only 1. So it will not be 3, it will be 1, because every time I am reading the current state. So this dot state dot counter. So whenever you set state, the component will re-render. So re-rendering will happen after that the component state will get updated. So the always whenever you are executing this code, the current state value is 0 initially. So in all of the set state, current state value is 0. So you are always incrementing 0 plus 1, 0 plus 1. So you will not see 3. So in that case, you use functional way. So you define a function where you will automatically get the previous state. And from this, you return a new object, because state is an object. Now, instead of using this dot state, you use previous state dot count. So now if you are doing like this, it will not be have any issue. So let me comment this out. So what you are doing, so with this, the counter will be incremented last. So after executing this line, the counter will be 3, not 1. Why? Because every time you are taking out the previous state. So before executing setting this state, React will check what was the previous value of counter. So it will correctly set it to 3. So this will become 1, this will become 2, and this will become 3. So if you have multiple set state calls one after another, then it's preferred to use functional way of setting state. Otherwise, all the time use this object way, because this is simple and you don't have to write a lot of code. So here loading and error message. So you can also write in conditional way is loading. So like this. So always make sure you cannot write like is loading here, because you always need a parent container. So it all the code that you write is converted to react.create element. So that needs a parent element inside which you are rendering all the content. So you cannot have direct condition. You need either this fragment syntax or div. Inside that only you can write condition. So I can write is loading, then I can display this. Else I can again check is error or error message, then do this. Else I can display all of this content. So this is also valid, but this is complicated and it's difficult to understand. So if you add some more condition, you will have more nesting. So never go beyond one conditional during this ternary operator. So this is fine, one question mark and one colon. Don't add extra colons. So you should not have multiple columns. That code becomes complicated and it's difficult to understand. So instead of using conditional, you can also use this way. So immediately returning. So this has the advantage of not executing the next code. So your application will be faster because you are not executing some extra code. You are immediately returning. This is known as early return from a function or anywhere. So you are checking that code initial itself. So you don't need to check that at every place. So you need to remember this. Don't go beyond one condition in ternary operator. And here you always need these brackets. These are for better formatting. So these are not required, but this is wrong. So if you save this, you can see semicolon is added. So you are not returning anything. So that's why we normally use this bracket. So you can also indent nicely. So you can have that code, actual JSX code outside. So that's it for this. And whenever you are using map, always use unique key. So key should not change on every re-render. It should be same. So you can have multiple users one also. So the key can be same for both of them, but for looping these users, these key should be unique. So you can have same key for your entire application, but for that particular map, in that particular map, you should not have key repeated. So always have some UUID you can create, or use ID if the data is coming from the API. Use ID as a key. This is very important. So if the component re-renders, if the key is same, React will not recreate this entire user component. Otherwise, if key is changed, this user component is recreated on every re-render. So you will have performance issue. So re-rendering is not an issue, but if you are unnecessarily re-rendering, then that's an issue. So if you give this unique key, then even though this code gets executed 100 times, that is not an issue, because you React will not be creating everything. It sees that key is same, so it reuses already available data, already available JSX DOM. So that's very important. Always try to think if you are using unique key or not. Never, don't use index as the key. So here we discuss the basics of JSX, React. So every code you write, every JSX is this is a JSX. So JavaScript XML syntax. So you can have HTML tag, and inside that you can add dynamic content. So every JSX is converted to React.create element core. You are rendering using render method. So this is version before version 18, you use React DOM.render, and after version 18, React DOM is a separate. You need to import from client. You can see you need to import from client, and you use create route. So this is specific to version 18, and in version 18, if you check package.json, we are using React version 18. So in version 18, every use effect hook execute twice if you are using React.strict mode. So if you see some code is console.log from use effect is getting executed twice, you need to check if you are using strict mode. So in development only it executes twice, in production it's not executing twice. This is to make sure that you are writing correct code on the same code. Should every time the component re-render, the use effect should return the same code. So that's why this is useful, and it also identifies if you have some deprecated methods. So like component lifecycle methods, class lifecycle methods, you are using some deprecated method, you will get warning in the console by just including this extra component. So you write, whenever you write like this in like HTML tag, it's a component, so that you need to remember. So every time you are including your component inside this, that all the code, all the use effect hook inside this entire app component, their child components will be executed twice. So you can avoid that twice. If you still want this strict mode and you want to avoid that executing twice, you can use that uh, use ref hook, or here also in class component you can use. So class component don't have use effect hook, but if you are using functional component, you can use that use ref hook to avoid executing twice. So this is entire application contact manager app we have created. So here also you need to make sure we are declaring the component state in the parent, so all the component can access. And don't share the state directly, don't pass this state directly to any of the component. You always need to define a function. So if you want to change any of the component state, not just parent, any of the component state, if let's say there is this add contact component. So if I have some state here and I want to change that state, so don't pass that state directly to the child component. Create a function inside this component that will update that state, and pass that function as a prop to the particular child component. And from that child component, you just call this, just like this add contact. So here we are passing add contact. So inside this add contact, we are updating the state. So here itself, you are updating the state. So you have control over what you are doing. If you pass that state directly to child component, that component has complete access to your state. So it can change anytime. So it can change anything in your application, and debugging becomes difficult, and it's a security issue. So if you have some private information in the state that you don't want to share with any other component, that component still has access to that. So you should always avoid passing directly state, declare a function. So it's also interrogation. So if I want to update state of parent component from child component, how can I do that? So for that, you need to declare a function in the parent component, and in that function, you update that state. And that function, you pass it as a prop to the child component. And from child component, you call that function. So whenever you want to update the state. So this is a common thing, and this is the perfect way to update state of parent component. So this is all about this. So always try to create separate component, even if it's a header, then left side navigation, right side navigation. Even for a simple button, you can create a separate component. So it's easy to manage and easy to test. So you are always try to minimize the component code. So you can see we have a lot of information. Actual rendering starts at line 55. So you should not have this extra code. You should always try to avoid that. So you can use the use reducer hook as we have seen next. So using use reducer hook, you can avoid these functions: update contact, delete contact, add contact. All these will be avoided using use reducer hook. So this is all about normal way of creating components. So just like a beginner developer, how you create the component, how you store the state. This is all about class component. Now we have functional way. You can see we have now use reducer hook here. So hooks are you can use only in functional component. They cannot be used in class component. So you need to remember that. Starting with version 16.8 of React, you can hooks are introduced. So you can use lifecycle methods inside the and state inside the functional component. So before version 16.8, like 16.7, there were only functional components. So what is functional component? Functional component is a normal component, let's say header, which will just receive the props and it will use that prop and display something. So let's say h1. So I want to use props.title. So this is a functional component because it does not have any state, it does not have any use effect hook. So it just uses props you are whatever you are passing and display that. So this is functional component with hooks. So you are using custom hook, you are using state also if you have, you can use that. So these are functional component with hooks, and this is just functional component without hooks. So here our app component, so header and contact, this is also same. So we are using this use contact context and use theme, this is also context. So you can see the state here, functional component, we are not declaring state anywhere because that is declared inside this particular context, contact context. So we are creating provider and we are using use reducer hook, which has this particular reducer. So this reducer's initial state, so while calling use reducer, you can see this is the initial state, empty array. And every time you are adding contact, you are just returning that state. So this is the reducer. Reducer is a pure function. So never modify the state or action. You can see we are returning map method using arrays, map method. So map method always returns a new array. So why we use map method to display list inside a React component? Because map method always returns a new array. So you are not modifying that, and in the JSX you can only write something which will return some data. So like you can return string, object. You cannot display object because there is no behavior how object get displayed. So you can return string, number, array. So array you can directly write. So instead of directly writing, you can use map method, which will always return a new array. It does not mutate or modifies the original array. Filter also, these are all functional methods, functional way of writing, working with array. Map, find, filter, then reduce, solve, these are functional methods. So you can watch array methods. You can read this JavaScript array methods tutorial in my free code camp. So I have explained all the methods which you need to know for each map method with lot of examples, and which has CodePen demo and why you should use which method, advantage and browser support. So you can go through this, it's a long article. So you will better understand, these are very important methods. As a React developer, you should know these all these methods, how to and when to use find and filter. Filter method always returns an array even if there is no matching conditions, or this condition is not matched, it will always return an array even if it's an empty. But find method returns undefined if there is no match. So you can have multiple data matching. You can, for that you use filter. If you want the first matching result, use find. So whenever you want to update, always use map method. So when the condition is matched, we are spreading out. So you use spread operator, spreading out the data that you want to update. Otherwise, you return that contact as it is. This line is very important. So if you don't return, so from map, you always need to return. So if this condition is satisfied, you will return this. But what about if it's not satisfied? So that data will be undefined. So if you have 4 contacts, on first contact is matching, that will be you are returning, and all 3 will be undefined because you are not returning anything. So if you return that contact as it is, that will not be modified. So delete contact, use filter. So this is the reducer. Using reducer, you avoid writing extra code inside the component. So all your state logic goes inside the reducer, and you can reuse that reducer anywhere. So your component code becomes smaller. Yeah, you can see here. If you want to avoid executing some use effect hook twice, you can use this use ref hook. So initially set it to true. So when it's true, this will be executed, and you are now setting it to false. So now every time use effect hook executes, this code first if will never execute because current is false. So now every re-render, it will always go inside else. So if you have some don't want else, this is the code that you will be writing. So this code will only execute once when the first time component is mounted. So after every time the contact changes, this code will never execute because now the current value is false. So this condition never satisfies. So you can avoid this extra writing extra use effect hook using this single use effect hook by using useref. And whenever you create context, always create a provider which will wrap this context dot provider. Don't directly use context dot provider in any of the component. So you can use that here like this. Anywhere you can use, and as many contexts you want to use, you can use that. But this is a wrong way. So what will happen? Let's say so now every time this app component is re-rendered because some state changes or store updates. So here we have reducer. So that whenever the reducer changes, this component will get re-rendered to get that updated data. And whenever it re-renders, you have new object you are setting as a value. So on every re-render, you are setting a new object here. So you are always changing the value. And when you are using this way directly, all the components in between gets re-rendered. So unnecessarily you are re-rendering every component. So if some component is heavy, it's doing lot of operations, it's taking fetching data of let's say 10,000 users, you are still making that API call and it will slow down your application. So don't write directly context dot provider. Instead, you create a provider component like this and return that. So whatever you pass as a children is special prop in React. So whatever you pass, every component you pass or even a string you pass as a children, it will not be re-render whenever the parent component re-render. So whenever context changes, this component will re-render, but all the child component that you are passing will not be re-rendered because you are using children prop. So children prop does not get re-rendered. So only if the components are use context hook, any of the in-between components use context hook, then only that component gets re-rendered. So it will have that updated value. Otherwise, all other components will not be re-rendered. So there will not be unnecessary re-rendering. So always create a component, and you also create a custom hook like this, use contact, where you use that context. So you avoid these extra two imports. So every time I want to use context, you need to import this context, import context. So you have two extra contexts, and you can have this extra condition add. So if you are creating this custom hook, you can also add this extra condition. So it's useful for you while development. So if you are using this particular context outside any of the provider, then you will get error. So this will be error which is easy to understand. So as your application grows, it will be difficult to find where its error is coming. So with the correct error, you easily find out where is the actual error. So whatever context you are getting, you are just returning. So now everywhere you want to use this context, you can just use contact hook. So you just use that and you can take out whatever you want. So this is the preferred way. Always use custom hook whenever you are creating context, and always use create a component to render something. And all the state changes you do inside this particular component itself. And whenever the parent component, this component changes, you have a new value of object. So if you have lot of state here, you will be declaring some state also. So if you have lot of state in this particular component, you can use memo hook. So using use memo, you execute some code only once. So let's say I have list of users. So I have this list of users and I am fetching those users inside use effect hook. So here I am setting set users. I'm making API call, getting those users, and I am sorting them. So before displaying or sending to any of the component, I want to sort that. So I can use sorted equal to users dot sort. So can use a function first user, second user. So if it's an array of object, I need to return. So if here I can say if first user dot, let's say first name is before second user dot first name, then return -1. If this is return 1, return 0. So here we are sorting. So now this code executes every time your component is, this component is re-rendered, like whenever the state changes, which is performance issue. So every time if you have 1000 users, 10,000 users, you are again resorting them. So in this case, you can use that use memo hook. So here I will use memo, and I will return this. So also this is wrong. Users.sort, sort method always sorts the original array. So you need to use dot slice, or you can use the spread operator. So what you are doing now, you are returning that sorted array here. And now here you will be passing some dependency users. So only when the users change, this code will be executed. So you are sorting only when the users are changed, not every time component read. So this is a good for performance improvement. So use memo, there is use memo and use callback. So use memo, you use only when you want to get some value. So here you are returning some value. You can return anything. So I can return hello also. So here I am returning hello. So every time the component re-render, this code will not execute because there is no dependency. If you are providing dependency, whenever the dependency changes, you are returning this. So this is implicit return. And there is use callback. Use callback is used if you want to execute some function. So this is returning some value from function, and this is use callback is used to execute some function. So let's say I have display function where I am doing something, and I don't want to execute this function on every re-render. So in that case, you wrap that inside use callback. So this will be display function. Now this function use callback. So this function will, here will not have that. So this function will only execute if the dependency is changed. So you write function inside use callback and you return a value from use mem. So here you will get a value, some value, calculated value, like a sorted data. And here this display will be a function. It will not be value. So you can pass this function as a prop to any of the component or as a value to this particular provider. So this will be constant and it will not be changing every time the component re-render. So only when users change, this code will be re-executed only when the dependency changes and not every time component re-render. So if you want to avoid executing some function, use callback. And if you want to avoid some calculation, use memo. So that code will be executed only when the dependency changes. And if you are not passing any dependency, that code will be executed only once when the component is mounted. So this is use memo and use callback. Let me close this and open again.
So Yogesh, what is the difference between use effect and use memo? It is same, or
It
what
is
is the
same, but use memo, inside use memo, you execute some code and it will return some value. Use effect does not return a value. Use effect returns a function.
Oh, okay.
And use effect, when you are using use effect, it will execute, use effect always executes after the render. So once everything is rendered, and if you are executing some setting some state inside use effect, you have one extra re-render. So you have use effect hook, there is use effect hook. So let's say I have users here. And if I am setting this set users here, so what will happen? Whenever the, let's say, some dependency changes, I am re-executing this code. So first, whenever the component mounts, this code will be executed, whatever you are rendering. So this is a custom hook, so it also has use effect hook. So first code will be executed, and after executing all that code, now your use effect will execute. So now you are again setting state. So when you set state, again this component will re-render, and then after that your code will be executed. So every time component re-renders, your first code will be executed, whatever you are returning from that component, and then use effect executes. So the use effect always executes after render. So that's why you avoid, always try to avoid use effect, because you have one extra re-rendering if you are setting state. So use effect, from use effect, you always define a function. You are not returning a function. So use effect also returns a function. That's the only thing you can return from function. That is a cleanup function. So you, whatever you do in component will unmount, you do directly in the cleanup function. And use memo, you return a value that you can reuse in any of the every re-render. So every re-render, if the dependency is changed, then only that use memo code will be executed. Otherwise, it will not be re-executed on every re-render. And use callback, you define a function inside use callback. Use callback returns a function, always returns a function, and that function will only be executed once the dependency changes. So not every time the component re-render. So you should also avoid writing extra use effect, use callback, use memo if it's not required, because the data is getting cached. So if you are using use memo, whatever data you are returning is already cached in the memory. So every time the component re-render, if that dependency is not changed, you are getting cached data. So if you are defining function in use callback, if the dependency is not changed, you are getting that cached function. So to get that cached function, that data is stored in the memory. So as you use more use callback, use memo, you are increasing the memory space. So if required, then only use memo, like you are doing some complex calculation, or you are passing some function as a prop, and you don't want to re-execute that code every time the component re-render. In that case, only use callback. Use callback is only should be used when you are passing something as a prop to child component, and that something is a function. So you don't want to re-execute or recreate that function. So every time the component, functional component re-renders, all the code that you have written inside gets re-executed. So I have this app component, function component. So every time this component re-render, all the code gets re-executed. If you have some functions here, these functions will also be recreated on every re-render. So that's why you should avoid writing that extra code inside the component. So all the business logic you should move to custom hook, and you can add some, if you are returning some functions from that particular custom hook, write that in the use callback hook. So if you are passing that custom hooks, let's say here is a display function. So use contact has a display function. And in addition to context, I am passing display here. Now this display function I am passing as a prop here. So what will happen every time the contacts are changed, your this code will execute use contact. It will re-execute all code. You are again recreating that function, and you are again passing to the here. So as the prop function is changed, your component add contact component will again re-render. So that's extra re-render. So to avoid that, you can wrap this function inside use callback. So it's normal use effect hook like syntax. You have dependency. Now whatever you want to execute, you define here itself. So some code. So this is a function, you execute some code. So now every time the context changes, every time contact changes, this code will not be, this code whatever you have in written inside function will not be re-executed, because you don't have dependency. So as this dependency is not changed, whatever you are passing here, it will not change. And as the prop value is not changed, this component will not re-render. So you avoid extra re-render. So only when you are passing this function as a prop to any of the component, in that case use callback. Otherwise, if you are not passing that to any component, you don't need to use callback. Use normal function that executes, that works similar. So only when you are passing to child component, there is a performance issue, because every time that component will re-render, this child component will re-render. So to avoid that, if you are passing any function as a prop to any of the component that you are taking from use effect hook, then you use callback. Otherwise, don't use callback. So always try to avoid, don't use extra use callback and use memo. So if you are doing some extra calculation, larger calculation that you want to execute inside that particular every time component re-render, so use memo. So only when the values are changed, that code will be executed. So you can have square function, calculate square. So you have state a, set a, number one, number one. So I want to calculate this square. So number one into, let's say, number two, product, not square. So every time the component re-render, you are again executing this code. If it has some complex calculation, you are also using math dot, let's say, random function, and you are executing some code. So you have some complex code. So every time the app component re-render, because context changes, so there is no relation with number. Now the contexts are changed, your component will re-render. You are again recreating this code. This function is recreated. So all the code will again execute. So you are again recalculating this function data. So this is calculate for product function you are passing as a prop. So you can avoid that by passing prop. So you can avoid that using use memo hook. So you get this value. So this is the product, not a calculate product. This is not a function that I want to pass. Just I want this product. So if you are passing this value as a prop to this component, let's say I want to pass this. So this product is always executed. Whenever you call this product, this function will execute and it will return that data. So you can avoid that using use memo hook. So if I use memo, now I will just return this value. So as I am using external data like number one, number two, so you need to mention that as a dependency. So now whenever number one or number two changes, then only this code will execute. So you will not be recreating or re-executing this code again and again. So you, in this case, you can use memo, or you are using sorting or then filtering, then you are again doing some find operation. That is a lot of code. So you have a lot of users, you are doing filtering, sorting, all these things. In that case, you use memo. Otherwise, don't use memo for simple calculation. If I'm doing just number one plus number two, you don't need to use memo. This is a simple calculation. It does not require a lot of code. Lot of time is not wasted here. So you don't need use memo, you don't need use effect hook. Some people also use effect. So whenever number one changes, number two changes, then set that numbers total. That is unnecessary, because you are, whenever you set state in use effect, your component will re-render. So this is a normal calculation, set number one into number two. So you don't need use memo, you don't need use callback, you don't need a use effect. You can execute. So whenever number one changes or number two changes, component will enter, and you again calculate this product and you are sending that. So this is better than using use memo. So if you are doing some complex calculation, then only use memo. And if you are passing some function as a prop to any component, and that function gets changed every time you are doing some complex calculation in that function, then only use callback. Otherwise, don't use. So we also learn core redux. This is important, redux, understanding the basics of core redux, how it works. So this was the old way of connecting component. Now we have direct use selector. So you can directly get the state and you can directly have all the information. So whenever the component using use selector, now this component is connected to Redux store. So whenever this component Redux store changes, this component will again re-render, and you will have different data. So the data will change. You can use that data to pass it to the next component. So this is some extra code you need to write if you are using Core Redux. You need to write your action creator functions. You have here thunk function. You also need to declare constants here for all of those cases. You need to write reducer code, and if you have some nested property, you need to always return a new object, not change the state, so it becomes complex. So instead of that, we use Redux toolkit. So with Redux toolkit, you just define everything in slice. We have thunk, simple thunk. So all this code will be executed. This extra reducers code, where is extra? Yeah, this code automatically executes whenever the state changes for that particular thunk. So result comes, loading is loading. You can set that automatically. So you don't have to create separate reducer, separate functions. So you automatically get action creator functions when you are using this slice using Redux toolkit. So this is all about Redux toolkit. We also did guessing game and expense manager app. So router also we learned version 5, version 6, what's the difference. And this is final with entire Redux features, expenses, slice. So any question you have?
No, I mean, immediate questions are not there. I am on Redux now. I mean, in my practice.
Okay.
So all other things are clear, but just this, I will go through this use memo, use callback, which you have mentioned, and also the Webpack stuff we are not yet watch your video, which you have initially. So while practicing Redux, if I have any question, I will contact you. I mean,
yes. Okay then. Anything else?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, one question I have, Yogesh, it's general. So when we start with the project which is already implemented and in between and we are new to it, so is there any steps that we should use to understand the flow? Because sometimes they don't give us KT, so we are not much aware about like from where to start.
So you can go through that code. So always, as you know, there will be main dot. If you are using Vue.js, you have where check where you are rendering the code. Create root, or you can use React DOM.render. How the code flows. So you can install this React tree extension. So using that, there is no React, it's React tree. So using that extension, you can find out the hierarchy of component from where the data flows. So you can just select that file. Let's say, where is the main file? Main.tsx inside S. So you can see how the data flows from which component. And you can also install this locator.js extension. So once that is installed, you can just click here, control click or alt click if you are using Windows, and you can directly go to the code. So you can identify from where that code is written. So that way you can easily find out how the code works. So you need to debug whenever you are not understanding how the code is working. You can just add debugger. So anywhere, any function you want to see how it executes, just add debugger statement. So just this. So whenever this code gets executed, it will stop here. And as you added debugger, you need to open DevTool. Then only that debugger will work. So only if this DevTool is open, that debugger will have effect, and it will stop there whenever you click on something. So whenever this delete operation is executing, it will stop here, and you can navigate it one by one, or you can directly check what data is coming. So whenever you have some debugger point getting executed, you can at that time you can check the variables value, directly print it, like test variable is there. You can print that, you will get that value, what's the current value. You can identify that. So using these two things, you can debug or I understand all the code.
Okay.
Any other question?